The first Democratic primary debates for the 2020 presidential nomination were held on the 25th and 26th of June 2019. Anticipation was hot around the event, not only because it provided the first chance for the individual candidates to break away from the 22-person large pack, but because it marked the first time increasingly left notables like Bernie Sanders and Kamala Harris faced former Vice President Joe Biden, who had been simultaneously garnering constant controversy and dominating polls, who had looked straight through his primary challengers as he targeted Trump in early speeches, who was the only candidate to decline to participate in the New York Times' 18 Questions, 21 Democrats, Here's What They Said video series. Biden, seated middle, was the ambassador of the legacy of the Obama administration, of a bipartisan and comparatively centrist history. Many of those present took shots at his legacy, voting record, and presidential prospects. Eric Swalwell, for example, basically called him too old. But it was Senator Harris's comments that left the biggest mark, when she invoked personal history to demonstrate the consequences of Biden's anti-busing policies.
You also worked with them to oppose busing. And, there was a little girl in California who was part of the second class to integrate her public schools. And she was bused to school every day. And that little girl was me.
These debates were destructive. In early May, poll averages placed Biden at a high of 41.4% in Democratic nationwide polling. Following this first debate, Biden plunged well into the mid-20s, carving a path for his challengers. And though the second debate, held a month later, stabilized his disappearing lead, bringing him back up to a compromised 30%, several points ahead his most formidable challengers. That night, too, continued the same pattern of intense conflict for Biden. He clashed with Harris on health care. Cory Booker connected his record to mass incarceration, and Bill de Blasio interrogated him on deportation. The former bulldog of the Obama administration appeared shaky in his speech and responses, blindsided by these attacks. Will this pattern continue? It's still a long way until the Democratic convention in mid-2020. In the meantime, the relevant pool will shrink, and there will be several opportunities for every candidate to triumph or stumble in the public eye. And it's likely that Biden will hold his ground and continue to be a top contender for nominee. In prediction of this unforeseeable future, it's important to perhaps look at the past. This is the story of 4 presidential elections and 3 presidential runs that have defined Joe Biden's political career and legacy. It is the story of moderatism, bipartisanship, youth, age, weakness, and power. This is Faces. I'm Nathan Wilk. Picture this. It's November 1984. Incumbent Ronald Reagan, a Republican, has just won the presidential election over Walter Mondale in a landslide victory. Spotted blue only by Minnesota and the District of Columbia, Reagan's easy ride back to the White House was a second blow to the Carter legacy, whose top senior officials had both been defeated by the actor turned politician turned most powerful man in the Western world. Reagan is a very polarizing figure now, known for his administration's 12-year reign and treated like gold standard by Republicans, while seen as, well, as Huey Freeman from the Boondocks would put it.
Ronald Reagan was the devil.
To many Democrats, African Americans, and members of the LGBTQ community. Despite all this, his reputation as president was pretty middling to unremarkable. But in 1984, it was in good standing, at 58%. The Democratic Party wasn't completely powerless in the wake of these elections, having a large margin of control in the House. But it was in the Republican-controlled Senate where then 42-year-old Joe Biden had just won his 3rd re-election as representative of Delaware. despite some rumblings of a possible presidential run for 1984, even garnering a single vote at the Democratic Convention and filling out paperwork for one state. Biden had ignored those who asked him to consider candidacy. But after Mondale's defeat, Biden might have been just what the Democrats needed. The mid and late 1980s were a contentious era for the party, highlighting the timeless power struggle between left and center, seen today in the House's division between leaders like Pelosi and the squad of Cortez and company, seen at the 1968 Democratic Convention with the days of anti-Vietnam protest outside. Post Reagan's re-election, this divide was exacerbated by a shift to the right by Democrats feeling the need to pick up the pieces of these two lost elections. In 1986, Jesse Jackson accused these leaders of wanting to, quote, look like John Kennedy with hair flowing to the left and act like Ronald Reagan with behavior flowing to the right, end quote. Joseph Biden was perhaps best fit for that role going into a possible 1988 run. He was known for his electric, charismatic, relatable speech, warring against intellectual snobbishness among members of the Democratic Party. He was popular among the working class, and potentially he could be popular among baby boomers too. And he gained notoriety in this period through his outspokenness on congressional issues. Some complained about what they saw as a lack of a clear, quote, political identity, end quote. On policy, he was often a moderate, pivoting on abortion, pro-civil rights but anti-busing bills. More than 30 years later, of course, Harris's emotionally charged attack on Biden's busing history would be the moment that unraveled Biden's debate performance. But how that came to be was the result of much controversy over the possibly revolutionary program. For all Brown v. Board of Education did legally to fight segregation, it failed to override the other factors which prevented integration. Centuries of economic inequity and racist housing policy, which steeped these neighborhood schools in racial homogeny, and an era of white flight when the white and affluent fled to suburbs to escape black neighbors. This gap is commonly known as de jure, or legal, versus de facto, or indirect segregation. Granted, according to Leon Panetta, quote, there are few if any pure de facto situations. Lift the rock of de facto, and something ugly and discriminatory crawls out from under it. In 1972, Joe Biden was elected junior senator of Delaware. After serving as a city council member and receiving encouragement from a floundering Democratic Party in the state, Biden entered and won a tooth-and-nail uphill battle against veteran Republican Caleb Boggs, who held the position 13 years and who ran again out of obligation. Biden won using many of the skills and favorable attributes he is today known for. A tell-it-like-it-is attitude, his Scranton upbringing, his strong speaking skills and charisma, honed by training as a young man to overcome a stutter. Biden performed well in districts which favored personality over policy. According to Biden, he told segregationist John Stennis in 1973 that he ran because of, quote, civil rights. As the youngest member of the Senate at the time, and after experiencing the loss of his wife and daughter in a car accident mere weeks before taking his seat, Biden's initial ambitions were stunted, and his acclamation of power started slow. But many members of the Senate looked upon him with sympathy, and he began to make powerful friends and allies from all over the political spectrum. From liberals like Ted Kennedy to Democrat segregationists like Stennis to many Republicans. Says Biden, quote, in those days, Democrats and Republicans actually enjoyed each other's company, end quote. He also claims that, quote, the series of interlocking gears that propelled even the smallest of the Senate's movements was personal interaction. In office, Biden became a fierce member of the anti-busing movement. Some activists have theorized that this resulted from pressure he received for being perceived as, quote, too liberal for his home state. Biden himself denounced what he viewed as the implication, quote, that your black, curly-haired son has to be in class with my white, straight-haired one before he can get a decent education, end quote. In 1975, he introduced a provision that would prohibit federal funds from being used for busing programs. The left rallied against it. The NAACP sued. Then, in 1978, the Senate voted to reject a proposal introduced by Joe Biden and fellow Delaware Senator William Roth that, according to Roth, would require a court establish that, quote, a discriminatory purpose in education was a principal motivating factor in the constitutional violation for which busing is proposed as a remedy, end quote. This would have stalled the implementation of busing programs around the country, raising the burden of proof. Now, busing isn't without its flaws, but Biden's reaction to it illustrates a consistent trend in his approach to civil rights. He's vowed to fight against racism, up until the point that it interferes with his white constituents. Biden wanted a sense of unity above all else, even if the racial conflict could lead to the furthering of equity. But the more blatant division of Ronald Reagan in 1984 crossed the line. Biden says, quote, the Reaganites were successfully pitting white against black, management against labor, the middle class against the impoverished, end quote. So he began to sharpen his rhetoric into a crowd-stirring weapon, but with the intention of using it only in the Senate. And he would get his chance soon. But forces were stronger than ever in trying to get him to run for the highest office as well. Despite Biden's reservations, stemming from his bad relationship with the press, his relative youth, his demanding position as the new head of the Judiciary Committee, and a lack of ideas about what he would do as president, he was convinced to join the relatively open field for 1988 because, quote, I couldn't string along the political operatives forever, end quote, and he officially announced his candidacy in 1987. Frontrunners to emerge for the 1988 election included Gary Hart, a rising Colorado star who was torpedoed by an infidelity scandal, civil rights activist Jesse Jackson, and the strongly liberal eventual nominee, Governor of Massachusetts Michael Dukakis. Despite initial polling failing to favor Biden, he saw himself as the best possible candidate to unite the country, and dedicated himself to a strategy he would re-employ in the 2008 election, picking off the working class of early caucus states to gain momentum. As Biden fought relative obscurity, he was not the superstar that he is today. He was thrown into a very public debate over the nomination of Robert Bork by Reagan to the Supreme Court. An uber-textualist extremist, Reagan's choice had the prospect of reversing landmark decisions that held up protections of privacy, racial equity, and even the one-man, one-vote principle from Baker v. Carr that helped secure fair elections. Biden, in a position of power to fight the confirmation of the nominee in the Senate, divided his attention between his candidacy and developing sound ideological arguments for the hearings. It was this stress, in addition to the symptoms of a brain aneurysm that would later nearly kill Biden, that he claimed contributed to the loss of his campaign. Biden was overworked. He liked his Senate career, and he wanted to turn back, but too many had invested in his success as a nominee. And then it happened.
Biden's critics say he sells himself as a man whose words and visions can inspire a new generation in politics. But if the thoughts, phrases, and visions really belong to others, it's a form of false advertising.
When Biden was accused of plagiarism in his closing remarks of a Democratic debate, he used many justifications for why he lifted words directly from a United Kingdom politician. At the time, he made the argument that, quote,
in the marketplace of ideas in the political realm, the notion that every thought or notion or idea you'd have to go back and find and attribute to someone, I think is, quite frankly, ludicrous.
In 2007, he called it a slip of the tongue, a lack of attribution, as a result of his frantic schedule. But as journalists searched through Biden's past, they found more occasions of plagiarism, dating back to school papers. And whether or not linking these into a pattern of dishonesty was just, the evidence supported the notion that Biden was style over substance and hit Biden's long-shot chances hard. Quote, could we save my presidential campaign and stop Bork? And which was the most important? End quote. Biden chose Bork. And the candidate who didn't really want to be president in the first place brushed off the constant pressure to run, at least for then. Joe Biden's controversy in this 1988 election did not sink his political career. In fact, Over the following years, Joe Biden became one of the most powerful men in the United States political system. His commitment to the hearings on Bork and his ideological warfare led to a failure to nominate the controversial judge. Instead, then-President Reagan privately consulted with Biden on a judge who he would approve of, leading to the nomination of Anthony Kennedy. Kennedy, of course, became a decisive swing vote for many years until he retired in 2018. It was his contribution to the court that yielded the 5-4 vote in Obergefell v. Hodges, which legalized gay marriage. Biden's consultation power held over future presidents, too. His authority in foreign policy led many elects coming from governor positions, who Biden said, quote, had all been shy about talking on big issues of foreign policy, to defer to him. During ethnic cleansing in Bosnia, it was Biden's speeches on the Senate floor that led Clinton to begin bombing the perpetrators, and his lack of permission that stopped Clinton from ending the attacks early. Clinton called him, asked Biden what he would do if the attacks halted. And because Biden threatened to hold a press conference and denounce the action, the endeavor carried to the end. In 2001, President George W. Bush consulted Biden before heading on his trip to Europe. And throughout all these years, as a respected senator and the head of the Foreign Relations Committee, he met with countless officials from various powers around the world. In 1992, Biden introduced the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act, which of course would later be lambasted by Cory Booker in the 2020 debates.
There are people right now in prison for life for drug offenses because you stood up and used that tough on crime, phony rhetoric that got a lot of people elected, but destroyed communities like mine.
It is mentioned for mere sentences in Biden's autobiography, and only then to highlight the inclusion of the Violence Against Women Act, which, granted, Biden fought for years to get passed, and which federally outlawed protections for abusers in addition to providing funding for victims' programs, protecting millions of women. But this tough-on-crime bill it was attached to, penned by Biden, was controversial anyways. In his 2008 campaign, Biden boasted that it added 100,000 cops to the streets, a move controversial to many activists in communities with tumultuous relationships with the police. And while it added $6.1 billion in funding for prevention programs, it also added $9.7 billion for prisons. It hardened the war on drugs. It prompted several states to implement TIS laws, which cut down on parole opportunities. And it came from a pessimism towards the prospect of rehabilitation, which Biden outlined in a speech supporting it.
It doesn't matter whether or not they had no background that enabled them to become socialized into the fabric of society. It doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society. They are beyond the pale, many of those people. Beyond the pale. And it's a sad commentary on society. We have no choice but to take them out of society. And the truth is, we don't very well know how to rehabilitate them at that point. That's the sad truth.
What it didn't do was massively extend the already blooming issue of mass incarceration in the United States, which grew mostly before the 90s, partially as a result of other policies which Joe Biden was involved in, such as the creation of a sentence disparity of crack versus cocaine and a bill Biden co-wrote in 1986. The Anti-Drug Act was criticized heavily by Democrats. Worth mentioning is that the justification of the crack-cocaine distinction, a concoction of racism at its most basic level, was later challenged by Biden, who sought to reverse it later in his political career and during his 2008 presidential campaign. With his power in the Senate, it's no wonder that Biden did not opt to run for president in 92 or 96 or 2000. But following the terrorist attacks on 9/11, his position began to change. Bush, initially torn between the mainstream advice of his Secretary of State Colin Powell, plus figures like Biden, and the neo-isolationism of Vice President Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, began to fixate his ear on the latter camp. Communication slowed. Biden has been criticized for voting to authorize the invasion of Iraq, which Bernie Sanders and Barack Obama, for example, were already opposing at that time. However, according to Biden, he believed he could avoid all-out confrontation. He held hearings to try to inform the public about the consequences of an Iraq conflict. In 2002, he introduced a more restrictive authorization ahead of conservatives, the Biden-Lugar resolution, that would make invasion only permitted once every other option was expended. It failed, and he signed on to a more conservative alternative, hoping for further negotiation, saying that, quote, acting alone must be a last resort. But this authorization ultimately gave George Bush the power to make the choice, and he chose war. As Bush's battle with Saddam Hussein waged, Biden became frustrated and disillusioned with the nature of the conflict. He would later say that the Bush, quote, administration's mishandling of Iraq may be the greatest foreign policy blunder of our time. His issues included a lack of proper counterinsurgency measures, meaning that the U.S. would continue to gain and lose the same territory over and over, false intelligence, and premature engagement. But no matter how much he pushed him, Bush would not listen. In 2004, John Kerry won the Democratic nomination, and Biden knew that, if elected, Kerry would consider offering him the position of Secretary of State. There, Biden would have greater control over conflict in the Middle East, and could begin to change the direction of U.S. foreign policy. Plus, Biden respected Kerry, who he called, quote, a man of experience and character, end quote. He was a veteran. The race seemed winnable, and Biden held faith that the American people would choose him. But of course, that didn't happen.
Thank you all for coming. We had a long night and a great night.
After a close race, Bush won re-election and pursued 4 more years of policy guided by Cheney and Rumsfeld's same philosophy. Biden was bewildered. He soon began to consider a 2008 run. As he says in his autobiography, quote, there were things I believed I could do for the country, things I felt prepared to do for the country, and for the first time in my career, I wasn't sure I could do them as a United States Senator. Bush's acclamation of power highlighted the importance of the presidency. His unwillingness to take input made Biden thirst for it. And if there was any hope to reunite the American people, Biden thought he was it. Announced in January 2007, Joe Biden's presidential campaign aimed to repair foreign relationships and, quote, point the American people to the future within their reach, end quote, domestically. In the inaugural video, he said he ran to fix conditions in Iraq, quote, above all else. His plans included expanded college support, if they seem quite limited in today's standards, steps towards universal health care, and a multi-state solution to Iraq's internal conflict. Biden's ongoing distaste for growing divisions between left and right was another key issue. Quote, the divisiveness and shrill partisanship of the Bush administration has dimmed the bright light of that promise for a better tomorrow, he wrote. He considered Chuck Hagel, a Republican, for his vice presidential choice. Later on, he showed interest in running as McCain's vice president, as well as Obama's. While Biden outnumbered them in years on the job and outranked them in foreign policy, the other Democratic candidates proved difficult to defeat. Much of the Democratic establishment was fixed on Senator Hillary Clinton, whose husband's presidency had ended on a popular note and whose wit and law experience gave her star power, while the young generation gravitated towards Barack Obama, a freshman in the Senate, campaigning on the need for a shift away from traditional Washington leadership. Senator John Edwards from North Carolina also polled well. The primaries were brutal and debates were constant. Biden's only hope was to gain initial momentum through the Midwestern states that went first, and use that to snowball into a frontrunner. He told the Associated Press, quote, my expectation is that I come in first, second, or an indistinguishable third in Iowa. To tell you the truth, if I don't, then this has been a nice exercise and I'll see you again when you come to visit Washington. Iowa held the first caucus on January 3, 2008. Joe Biden finished 5th. He garnered just 0.9% of the popular vote. He left the race 4 days later. Of course, this was not the end of the story for 2008. In the following months, the heated battle between Hillary and Obama surged on, as other contenders quickly dropped out, even Edwards, who had bested Clinton in Iowa. In June, Obama was declared the winner, and Biden was on his short list of potential vice presidents, also including Evan Day, Southern Governor Tim Kaine, and Kathleen Sebelius. And despite some conflicting statements brought on by the long debate cycle, a McCain ad would highlight a Biden comment where he said that Obama wasn't ready to be president, the nominee went with the senator from Delaware. Biden brought some really important factors to the Democratic ticket: legitimacy, experience, and a pulse on lower-income white voters, who Obama initially struggled to capture. Considering his involvement in the Violence Against Women Act, he helped bring in women who backed Hillary and were unsure of Obama because of the venomous primary race, and he could help the new president be bipartisan. A central concern with the choice of Biden was that the Obama campaign ran on change of leadership, yet chose a long-running member of the establishment for VP. But in a speech in Springfield, Illinois, where he was welcomed to the campaign, Biden made clear that he had assimilated to the themes of the movement. He highlighted the importance of change to Democratic leadership, attacking John McCain by associating him with the Bush administration.
These times call for a total change in Washington's worldview. These times require more than a good soldier. They require a wise leader. A leader who can deliver the change we need. I'll say straight up to you, John McCain, and the press knows this, is genuinely a friend of mine. But the harsh truth is, ladies and gentlemen, you can't change America when you boast. And these are John's words. Quote, "The most important issues of our day, I've been totally in agreement and support of President Bush."
It was an interpolation of the central message that could appeal to centrists. Reactions to the choice were positive. Here's what Governor Ed Bendell of Pennsylvania had to say.
But Joe Biden's going to grow in the American people very fast because he's a tremendously engaging guy, a tremendously bright guy, and a guy who's sort of Harry Truman-like. He tells it like it is.
Obama-Biden ended up winning the electoral and popular vote, including large portions of the Midwest, and Biden began working with the Senate to remedy the Great Recession in 2008. While vice president, Biden retained his aging status as someone who was gritty, tough, and outspoken. In reaction to the 2012 vice presidential debate with Paul Ryan, where Biden repeatedly laughed at his opponent, Saturday Night Live's Seth Meyers remarked that, quote,
"Congressman Ryan prepared for Thursday's debate by studying policy and holding practice debates, and I think Biden prepared by shotgunning Red Bull and watching Yosemite Sam cartoons."
But this evident poking of fun actually highlighted a very beneficial contrast between the president and the vice president. While Obama's generally straight-faced demeanor, plus his careful and logical tackling of questions and disagreements in debates, elevated him above a lot of political infighting, Biden's expressiveness and outspokenness acted as a source of subverted communication from the heart of the administration. This connectedness was only aided by the kinsmanship shown between these two men in interviews and White House footage, downplaying any disagreement or dysfunction that were ever to occur between them. Perhaps, whether intentional or not, this dynamic served to subvert racist stereotypes. From questions over Obama's U.S. citizenship, pushed by his Democratic opponents, Republican arch-rivals, and others, to lynched dolls, there was a swirl of racism surrounding the first black president. It seems natural, then, that he would want to stray as far as he could from the caricature of an aggressive African-American male. But to not appear weak, he placed this role in a person who enjoyed a positive connotation with a scrappy, booming personality. Joe Biden, the white, tell-it-like-it-is patriarch. November 9th, 2016, the dynamic the president and vice president created was on full display in a sorrowful speech delivered by Obama after the election of Republican Donald Trump over former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. Despite the loss, Obama landed on a message of hope and a plea for unity. He even flexes some of the trademark Obama-Biden humor, heckling his friend over his unsuccessful presidential runs. Meanwhile, while barely on camera, Biden kept a sterner face, delivering small, comical gestures and painting a picture of greater disappointment. Biden was very torn on running in that election, but ultimately stepped aside. Reportedly, there was pressure from inside the Obama administration to keep the path for Hillary open, and Biden was dealing with intense grief over the death of his son around decision time. But nonetheless, announcement speeches were written, and Beau Biden before his death had called on his father's, quote, duty to seek the highest office. If Biden had ran, it is likely that the Bernie Sanders campaign, which so radically altered the party, would not have gained the same foothold. Sanders' democratic socialism originated from the far left and swooped up many potential voters who distrusted Hillary Clinton, an issue that plagued Clinton throughout her political career, especially after Benghazi. This, in tandem with the movement's message of fixing a fundamentally broken economic system, brought a formerly obscure senator to the front line of American culture and emboldened millennials. It is worth noting that some of Bernie's campaign managers don't agree on this theory, and were actually inviting the chaos that would be created if Biden had joined, but regardless, it's interesting to think about. In the 2020 Democratic field, frontrunners are noticeably more left than in 2016 or 2008. Elizabeth Warren, at the moment the next in line for the nomination behind Biden, according to many polls, is a close friend of Sanders and shares his ideas of Medicare for all, free college education, and challenging the wealthy in Wall Street. Whether the chicken or the egg came first in this situation is difficult to distinguish, but certainly Bernie proved that a non-moderate could be a viable candidate. Viable isn't always enough, though, and Hillary bested Bernie. In the general election, she faced a similarly left-field candidate who had challenged a dynastic frontrunner. But whereas Clinton scraped by Sanders, Jeb Bush and company lost to businessman Donald Trump. And despite that Hillary was projected to win by most media sources, and that she even won the popular vote, Trump won handedly in the Electoral College, a combination of some Clinton campaigning blunders, Trump's dedicated voter base, and unceasing questions of ethics over Benghazi perpetuated by Republicans. Historically blue states, many of them Obama states, were flipped.
I've just received a call from Secretary Clinton. She congratulated us, it's about us, on our victory.
After the devastating loss in November 2016, there was much remorse surrounding Democratic choices. Biden, this superstar king of the Midwest, could have won those states, many thought. And this was the feeling that has presided over the 2020 race, the idea that, even for those who aren't passionate about Biden's history or current policy, the best bet to prevent another 4 years in office of Donald Trump is a return to the Obama administration. Donald Trump is in many ways a foil to how Biden feels public officials should act. This disparity is not in policy, as evident by Biden's willingness to engage with fierce segregationists and vote for, even help create, very racially divisive policies and laws. Rather, this is a disparity of respect, courtesy, of reaching across the aisle, and of keeping the country united under strong leadership. Trump is the boogeyman of Biden's America, insulting his political opponents, calling for their imprisonment, using his office to promote unfiltered racism and xenophobia. He is a far cry from the Republican Party of old, who befriended, guided, and nurtured Biden after the death of his wife in 1972. Biden's campaign announcement video for 2020, released in April 2019, highlights Donald Trump's comments on the Charlottesville protests, where he claimed there were, quote, very fine people on both sides, end quote. These echo the Reagan-era divisions described earlier. This is where the line is crossed for Biden. With two presidential runs to compare to, as well as Biden's recent statements, it is easy to explain this hectic and confusing nomination cycle. Because for any of Joe Biden's political runs, whether in 1988, in 08, or in 1972, he has characterized them as an act of duty rather than one of ambition. There's a sense of responsibility there. Here's Biden again.
But if we give Donald Trump 8 years in the White House, he will forever and fundamentally alter the character of this nation, who we are, and I cannot stand by and watch that happen.
This explains a lot of the turmoil in the debate. Biden does not seem equipped for Democratic debates because his qualms are not ultimately with Kamala Harris or Booker or anyone else. While similar moderates like John Delaney and Michael Bennet have spent their speaking time passionately trying to dismantle and dismiss far-left policies like Medicare for all, Biden seems always on the defensive, always referring to precedent rather than new ideas, mostly unwilling to fight unless backed into a corner. Biden does not want radical change to healthcare, to student debt, or to environmental policy from a 2012 Obama system. That is clear in his proposals. Rather, he wants to restore, quote, the soul of the country, end quote. As a candidate who is projected to beat Trump, who has been bipartisan, who can capture this elusive Midwest, this is what he sees as his duty. But whereas in 2008, when Biden was coming off of a powerful Senate career, sharp as a tack, ready to fight, Biden in 2020 feels like an old boxer, brought out of retirement for one last fight. Out of his element, in a transformed world and far less coherent than before, the 76-year-old's road to the White House seems turbulent. The record that Biden built up over decades, which he shows pride in, is being picked apart. And there's still a lot that can happen before November 2020. But I guess we'll just have to wait and see. This is Faces. I'm Nathan Wilk. Hey everybody, thanks so much for listening to the first episode. Shoutouts to CNN, to Vox, to the Associated Press and their archives, and to Joe Biden's autobiography, Promises to Keep, in particular, for making this episode possible.